Hey there. Tonight, we won't be stepping into the grand salons of Paris or following powdered nobles to their balls. We're going somewhere colder, hungrier, to the narrow alleys and worn-out kitchens of revolutionary France. A time when bread cost more than a day's wages and hunger wasn't a symptom of poverty, it was the law of the land. Dim the lights, settle in, and let's walk into the streets of 1790s France, where surviving one more day often came down to whether your neighbor starved before you did. The boy's name was Emile, though he hadn't heard it spoken kindly in months. He woke up to shouting, again. Not soldiers this time, neighbors, fighting over something. He rolled off the haymat and listened through the thin wooden walls. A woman screamed, a man cursed, then silence. Paris was always loud, but it had become a different kind of loud lately. Angrier, quicker, desperate. The fire had gone out in the night. Again. He didn't bother trying to relight it. There was no food to warm. His mother sat in the corner, her hair wrapped in a scarf that hadn't been washed since the Bastille fell. Her hands trembled in her lap, not from cold, but from the same hunger that had kept them both silent for 2 days now. "We'll go to the bakery," she said finally, voice cracking. "Today there may be some." Emile didn't argue. He just nodded and slipped on the same torn shoes he'd worn since spring, the ones with no soles. The streets were filled with smoke, not from chimneys, those were cold. The smoke came from carts and barrels and wood from broken chairs burned on street corners. The air smelled like boiled leather and dust. The line at the bakery was already long, and no loaves had even arrived. People didn't speak much in line anymore. They just watched each other, eyes sunken, hands clenched. If someone cut in front, they might not be pushed, they might be stabbed. It had happened before. The baker's door stayed shut for hours. Someone whispered that the flour shipment had been stopped by the National Guard. Another said the baker's son had been arrested. He'd hoarded grain. Finally, the door creaked open. No loaves. Just news. "Nothing today," the baker muttered, eyes downcast. "Maybe next week." Someone screamed. A woman fainted. Another tore a wooden slat from the bakery window and tried to break through before being yanked away by 2 others. Emile's mother gripped his hand tighter and pulled him back, away from the growing storm. But he saw it, what the rest of them saw. The baker, his hands, flour under his nails. He had eaten. That night, Emile learned what hunger did to the heart, not just the belly. It made you see enemies and neighbors. It made you dream of rats roasted over candle flames. It made you stop asking questions like, "What's for dinner?" and start asking, "What's still alive?" In the silence of their dark room, Emile curled up and closed his eyes. He didn't cry. Not anymore. That wasted water. By the next morning, the news had spread. A baker in the 6th arrondissement had been hanged. No trial, no guards, no judge. Just a rope and a crowd and a whisper that he had fed his family before the people. Emile's mother didn't cry when she heard. She simply stirred the boiling pot of weeds and onion skins she'd found the night before. It wasn't soup, it was color and heat, but it filled the air with something that almost smelled like hope. They sipped slowly. Each mouthful was more steam than broth. Later that day, the rations cards arrived. A man in a frayed uniform pounded on each door, handing out slips of paper like they were made of gold. The crowd followed him like shadows, begging for extras, screaming about missing children, dead husbands, lost papers. Emile's mother handed him their card. "Don't drop it," she said. He didn't. The next morning, she sent him to the government depot, a gray building near the edge of the Seine where rations were distributed. Emil had never been that far alone before, but children were less likely to be robbed on the way back. Adults made better targets. The line wrapped around the building twice. Armed men stood at the corners. Their uniforms were stained, their boots worn, their hands on their muskets. "Quiet!" one barked, as a man near the front groaned and fell to his knees. "No one eats if there's a riot." Someone helped the man stand. Another handed him a crust from their sleeve. That tiny act of kindness almost brought Emil to tears. After 4 hours, it was his turn. He stepped forward, handed the card to the man at the window. The man looked him over, too thin, too pale, too small. "You from Rue Charlemagne?" Emil nodded. The man stamped the card and handed him a sack. It was lighter than Emil expected. He peeked inside. A handful of lentils, half a loaf of dry bread, 3 potatoes, one of them already sprouting. No flour, no cheese, no oil. "You'll be back next week," he grunted. "If we live that long," Emil muttered, but not loud enough to hear. On the way home, he passed a group of boys fighting over something. He looked closer. A pigeon, dead, still warm. They were arguing who had seen it fall from the rooftop first. Emil didn't stop. He didn't have the strength. Back home, he placed the sack on the table. His mother didn't say anything, just split the loaf in half and tucked one side away in a drawer like it was treasure. They ate that night, slowly, chewing each bite until the bread dissolved on their tongues. There was no talking, only the sound of chewing and the quiet scraping of spoons. And in the alley outside, someone wept. By the 3rd week of July, the heat in Paris was thick and oily, pressing down on the city like a hand that never lifted. The smell of sweat, rot, and unwashed clothes lingered in every alley. Emil had grown used to it. You could get used to anything if it didn't kill you. His mother's hands had started shaking more, especially in the mornings. Sometimes she forgot things. His name, what day it was, whether they had eaten. Once she put pebbles in the pot instead of lentils. When he pointed it out, she laughed. Not like before, not kindly. Her laughter scraped the walls like a rusted knife. The bread was gone. The potatoes had gone soft, and when she cut into one, it was black and sour inside. Still, they boiled it. Still, they ate. At night, Emil lay awake and stared at the cracked ceiling. It looked like a map of rivers, rivers that didn't lead anywhere. The neighbors had started disappearing. The woman from the apartment above, who used to hum while sweeping, hadn't been heard in days. The couple downstairs had argued less because the man had gone out and never returned. The streets whispered rumors, food riots in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, children stealing from soldiers. Bakeries burned to the ground. Emil began to understand that hunger wasn't just emptiness, it was a presence, a thing with a mouth and eyes and long fingers that reached through shutters and keyholes, looking for someone soft enough to take. One afternoon, on his way back from filling a cracked jug with water from the public pump, he saw a girl standing near the church ruins. She had red hair, bare feet, dirt on her face. She was roasting something over a tiny flame. Meat. Emil's stomach turned at the smell. It was real, fresh. He could see grease dripping onto the coals. He approached slowly, as if walking toward a vision. She didn't look up. "What is it?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away, just turned the meat on the stick. "Cat," she said finally. Emil's throat tightened. "Yours?" She shook her head. "The neighbor's. It died yesterday." He didn't ask more. Hunger didn't leave room for judgment. She offered him a bite. He didn't take it. But he didn't walk away either. They sat in silence while the flames popped and hissed. After a long time, she asked, "Do you think it will end?" He looked at her, the soot on her cheeks, the faint scar on her lip, the hollow beneath her eyes. "No," he said, "not for people like us." Later that night, Emile returned home to find his mother asleep, her face sunken, her breathing shallow. He lay beside her, wrapping the last piece of cloth around them both. Outside, a crowd marched by, chanting about liberty and bread. Inside, there was neither. Just the soft wheeze of a mother too tired to dream, and a boy trying not to remember the smell of cooked cat.
The riot started with a rumor. Someone had seen a wagon stacked with flour, headed toward a noble house in the 9th arrondissement. Others swore it was guarded by armed men in blue sashes, royalists, some said. Thieves in uniform, said others. It didn't matter. What mattered was that somewhere, someone had flour, and everyone else had nothing. By the time Emile heard the shouting outside his window, the crowd had already swelled into a frenzy. Men with broken broomsticks and rusted blades, women with aprons still wet from laundry, babies tied to their backs. Even children, barefoot, thin-limbed shadows with rocks in their fists. His mother didn't stir. She had slipped into a strange stillness over the last 2 days, no longer hungry, no longer speaking, just blinking slowly as if the world around her had lost color. He pressed his forehead to hers and whispered that he would be back soon, just to see what was happening, just to see. Then he ran. The streets were pulsing. Paris felt like it was breathing hard through gritted teeth. Fires had started, not in rebellion, but out of desperation. Trash piles, broken shutters, even a wooden crucifix wrenched from a church wall. If it burned, it was fuel. The crowd surged toward the bakery near the Place du Carrousel. Emile recognized the place. It had been shuttered for weeks, but now the doors were open, not by invitation. People poured inside like water through a cracked dam. A boy no older than Emile hurled a sack of flour out the window before disappearing into the crush. A woman caught it, then screamed as another tore it from her hands. The sack burst on the cobblestones, a ghostly white cloud rising into the air before vanishing in the wind. Emile stood frozen. A man near him laughed bitterly. Look at them, fighting over crumbs like rats in a drowned cellar. Another shoved past him, better a crumb than a coffin. Someone grabbed Emile's sleeve. He turned. Red hair, dirt-smeared cheeks, wild eyes. It was the girl from the ruins. "They're headed to the noble quarter," she said. "They say the Marquis has stores of butter. Real butter." He followed her without a word, not because he believed it, but because hope, even hollow, was better than standing still. They reached the iron gates of the estate just as the crowd did. It was chaos. Guards trying to hold the line, rocks flying, screams not of rage, but of desperation. Hunger had teeth. Hunger had nails. Hunger wasn't a protest anymore. It was survival. Emile saw a man climb the outer wall, then fall, struck by something unseen. Another pushed a torch through the bars, lighting the ivy. The air filled with smoke and shouting and the sharp smell of melted wax. The gate gave way. It didn't creak. It screamed. Inside, there was no treasure, no butter, no bread. Only rooms stripped bare, paintings slashed, silver stolen weeks before. The Marquis was gone. The people stood in the empty halls, dust swirling in the torchlight, the silence heavy and bitter. And then someone laughed, high, harsh. a woman holding her baby. She laughed like something inside her had cracked in half. "We're starving," she said through tears, "and they're already gone." Emil looked down at his hands, empty, and for the first time he felt the weight of the revolution. Not the songs, not the speeches, but the gnawing ache in every belly that couldn't be silenced with slogans. Just bread. Just one loaf.
The next morning, the fires were still burning. Ash clung to the rooftops like a second snowfall. The streets were silent, not from peace, but from exhaustion. Those who hadn't joined the riot huddled in doorways, eyes sunken, watching the smoke rise from the noble district. The city smelled of soot and broken promises. Emil's shoes were soaked from crossing the riverbank. He hadn't gone home. He couldn't. Not yet. His legs carried him down alleyways he didn't recognize, his stomach tightening with every step. Last night had ended with an empty estate and a bleeding boy trampled by a panicked crowd. His red-haired friend had vanished in the smoke. He wandered toward the edge of the market square. There, beneath a flapping tarp, a man in a patched coat stood behind a crate. "Rabbit stew," he called. "1 coin, hot meat, real meat." Emil paused. The smell was delicious. He watched as a woman handed over a coin and was given a wooden bowl with a chunk of gray meat floating in thin broth. She didn't ask questions. She drank it like medicine. The man caught Emil staring. "Got something to trade?" he asked. Emil reached into his pocket and pulled out a single copper. The man grinned. "You're in luck." The stew was warm, salty, with flecks of green and black that might have been herbs, might have been ash. Emil didn't care. He drank it down until the last drop was gone. Only later did he ask what kind of meat it had been. The man didn't answer. He just laughed. By noon, Emil finally made his way home. His mother hadn't moved. Her breath was shallow but steady. He set the empty bowl on the table beside her. "We'll get more soon," he whispered. But inside, something curdled. That stew had been too rich, too filling. He had eaten rabbit before, once, a long time ago. This wasn't it. He tried not to think about what it had been, tried not to think about the missing dogs, the cats, the boy who had vanished from their floor last week. Paris was eating itself now. The next day, posters appeared on the walls near the cathedral ruins, thick black ink on cheap parchment. Bread Requisition Act. All known stores of grain, flour, and livestock are to be surrendered to the Committee of Public Safety for redistribution. Hoarding is punishable by death. That afternoon, a family 3 doors down was dragged into the street. Someone had reported them. A child had been seen carrying eggs. Real eggs. They screamed, denied, wept. It didn't matter. They were taken anyway. And no one asked where the eggs had gone. By evening, Emil saw people scavenging the cemetery, pulling weeds, tearing bark from trees. He helped his mother out of bed and wrapped her in the coat she hadn't worn since winter. They walked to the public square hoping for another ration, another whisper of flour. But the depot was closed. A soldier outside shouted, "Next delivery in 5 days." The crowd groaned. A man threw his hat at the gate. A woman collapsed. And Emil stood there, holding his mother's arm, wondering if 5 days was a number or a joke. They turned back. The air was full of smoke again. Only now, it didn't come from fires, but from the bakery across the street. Someone had broken in. Someone had found wood. Someone was baking. The smell of bread drifted through the broken shutters. And for the first time in weeks, Emil felt something sharp and bitter rise in his throat. Not hope, but fury. That night, Emil didn't sleep. He sat by the cracked window,
staring across the alley at the bakery, where faint orange light still glowed between the boarded-up slats. The scent of baked bread drifted through the air, sweet, warm, impossible. It wasn't just one loaf. It was many, dozens, a feast. No fire in Paris had ever smelled so cruel. His mother lay on the mattress behind him, thin arms folded over her chest like twigs crossing in the dirt. Her breath was shallow, but still there, still fighting. For now. At dawn, Emile slipped outside. The streets were ghost quiet. A thick mist crawled over the stones, hiding the shattered windows and blackened door frames. He wasn't the only one out. Others had come too, one by one, drawn like moths to the warmth. Old men with blankets around their shoulders, mothers holding quiet babies, children with swollen bellies and hollow eyes. They gathered in silence in front of the bakery door. Emile moved closer. A boy with a crooked nose whispered, "They say the baker's brother came back from Normandy, brought sacks of flour, hid them under the chapel ruins." Someone else added, "I heard he bribed the guards, pays them in salted meat." And a third, "It's not meat, it's something worse." No one said what that meant. The door creaked open. A man stepped out. Heavy coat, eyes sharp. He carried a tray with 4 loaves. Only 4. He set them on the stoop and turned, without a word. The moment he disappeared, the crowd lunged. It wasn't violence, not yet, just desperate hands, nails scraping stone, a scuffle, a scream. The bread vanished in seconds. Emile didn't reach it in time. A fist caught his shoulder. Another boy shoved past him. The tray clattered to the ground. When he stood again, only crumbs remained. He went home with empty hands. His mother didn't ask. She just closed her eyes. That evening, a new poster appeared. "Let the people eat. Tonight at the Place de la Révolution. Bread for the brave." No seal, no signature, no name. But it was enough. By sunset, the square was filled. Hundreds of people, a swelling tide of faces. Some carried knives, others stones. Emile came with nothing but his fists. In the center of the square stood a single cart, covered with a brown cloth, and guarded by 3 men in faded red sashes. "Where's the bread?" someone shouted. A man with the sash stepped forward. His voice was clear, cutting the air like a blade. He said, "You want bread? Then take it!" He ripped the cloth from the cart. Underneath, loaves. Dozens, maybe more. The crowd exploded. But this time it wasn't just hunger. It was fury, release. The dam had broken. The guard stepped back, and the cart was swallowed. Emile reached it, clawed at the crusts, snatched a loaf and held it to his chest like a stolen treasure. He didn't wait. He ran, back through alleys, past shuttered windows and crumbling walls, until he reached the door of his building and flung it open. His mother stirred. He knelt beside her and tore the loaf in half. "It's real. It's warm." She took a bite. Tears slid down her cheeks. Not for the taste, not for the hunger, but for the memory of what bread used to mean. It was hope. It was dignity. It was life. That night, for the first time in months, Emile slept. But the dream was not sweet, because deep inside he knew one loaf changed nothing, and tomorrow the hunger would come again.
By morning, the square was sealed. The cart was gone. The red-sashed men had vanished, so had the bread. And on the walls, beneath a tangle of tattered posters and charcoal warnings, a new decree had been nailed. Theft of state resources equals treason. Any unauthorized gathering will be dispersed by force. Bread is property of the People's Council. Emile read it twice. He had never thought of bread as treason. But in Paris, hunger had become a weapon, wielded not just by the rich, but by anyone with enough crumbs to matter. He watched as the guards returned, not the smiling ones with red sashes from last night. These wore blue, their coats stiff with dust and dried blood, tricorn hats askew from long days and longer nights. They dragged a woman by her hair through the Rue de la Consonnerie. She clutched a flour sack to her chest like a child. Her screams echoed down the alley. And Emile could see red fingerprints on her arms where she'd held it tight. They said she'd stolen it from a dead soldier. No trial, no chance. She vanished behind the iron doors of the Hôtel de Ville. No one spoke of her again. Inside Emile's apartment, the half-loaf from the riot was nearly gone. His mother's cheeks had lost their sharpness. Her eyes seemed brighter. But Emile felt no relief, only fear. A single meal could fool the body, could make it believe salvation had come. But it hadn't. Not really. And then came the inspectors. 4 of them. They knocked on every door, carrying thick ledgers and thin patients. Their boots caked with dust, eyes hollow from seeing too much. "Grain audit," one of them barked. Emile opened the cupboard. It was empty. They asked him how much flour he'd used that week, where he got it, whether anyone had given him bread. He lied, said a cousin from Bordeaux had come through. Just passing, just lucky. They didn't believe him. But they had other doors to knock on. Before they left, one of them paused. "You live alone?" he asked. Emile hesitated. "No, my mother." The inspector's eyes scanned the room. "Next time, show her face." Then he left. Emile closed the door and locked it twice. That night, the city howled. Dogs mostly. Hungry, wild. But also men. Fighting in the Rue Saint-Honoré over a single onion. Screams near the scene. The splash of a body hitting water. Someone, maybe 2, had jumped. Or been pushed. Emile didn't sleep. He sat by the hearth feeding the last crumbs of wood to a feeble fire, watching his mother breathe. Then, in the quiet hour before dawn, he made a choice. He wrapped the last coin in a strip of cloth and tucked it into his shirt. He put on his father's coat, the one with the broken buttons, and stepped outside. The bakeries were empty. The carts were silent. But Emile didn't walk toward the markets. He walked south, toward the salt tunnels, toward the dark where people whispered of black bread and worse trades, where flour was no longer bought, but bartered, with blood or secrets, or something far dearer.
The southern edge of Paris was not a place you found on any official map. Beyond the winding streets and past the overgrown cemetery walls, the city sank into a darker rhythm, a place of whispers and half-truths, where alleys bled into tunnels and names were seldom spoken twice. Emile walked with his head down, boots scuffing cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of forgotten footsteps. A gray mist clung low to the ground, curling around door frames and rusted lamplight like smoke from unseen fires. No one stopped him. Everyone here walked fast and alone. He passed a butcher's stall, boarded shut, but behind it a flicker of movement. A man sat sharpening a blade, not for meat, but for trade. Beyond that, a woman sat beneath an awning, selling sacks of dirt-colored flour. It didn't smell like grain,
Emil didn't ask. He kept walking. He found the salt tunnels by accident. An arched opening, half buried in ivy, gaped beneath the remains of a collapsed stable. No sign, no guards, just a steep staircase that vanished into earth. He stepped inside. The darkness swallowed him. The air grew cold, wet, heavy with minerals and secrets. He lit a stub of candle with shaking fingers and followed the carved path down, boots echoing against stone in silence. The deeper he walked, the less the world above mattered. Here, the revolution had no voice, no posters, no slogans, only hunger and trade. He turned a corner, and there they were. Dozens of people gathered in a chamber lit by scattered lanterns and smoky torches. Old brick ovens, salvaged from abandoned manors, glowed faintly in the gloom. Tables had been carved from slabs of rock. Bread rested atop them. Not the golden loaves of old Paris, but flat rounds of something dark, coarse, and bitter-smelling. Emil approached a man in a ragged scarf. "What is it?" he asked. The man didn't answer right away. He held up one loaf and broke it in half. The inside was gray, not fluffy, damp. "It's rye, mostly. Some acorns, some sawdust, little salt." Emil stared. "Better than stone," the man added. "Won't kill you fast." "How much?" The man looked him over. "What have you got?" Emil reached into his shirt and offered the cloth-wrapped coin. The man took it, bit it, nodded. "One loaf." Emil hesitated. "That's all?" "One coin, one breath. That's the rule." Emil took the bread and backed away. It was heavier than he expected. In another corner, he saw two boys fighting over a sack of mushrooms. A woman whispered to a vendor, then slipped behind a curtain, returning moments later with something small and round. The vendor was adjusting his belt. Nothing here was free. As Emil turned to leave, an old man caught his sleeve. "Don't eat the mold," he said quietly. "If it's green, you'll dream. If it's black, you'll die." Emil nodded and hurried back up the stairs, back into the city where rats danced in the gutters and hope came in crusts. He reached his home before sunrise. His mother stirred as he lit the fire. He tore the loaf in half and gave her the bigger piece. She took it, smelled it, didn't ask questions. He watched her chew. Her face tensed, then softened. "It's bread," she whispered. Emil smiled. But deep inside, something shifted. This wasn't survival anymore. It was endurance, and Paris was testing every soul it had left.
A week passed. The salt bread kept Emil and his mother alive, but barely. Each bite sat like stone in the stomach, leaving behind a dry bitterness that no amount of water could wash away. Still, it was enough. Enough to keep her eyes open, enough to keep her breathing, enough to keep Emil walking. But something about the bread haunted him. Not just the taste. There was something else, something in the way the old man had spoken, the warning about the mold, the colors, the dreams. Because Emil had started dreaming. At first it was nothing, a flicker of light, a child's voice humming an old tavern tune in an empty courtyard. But then it changed. He saw fire. He saw faces without eyes. He heard laughter coming from ovens that had never baked bread. And always the smell of smoke. On the seventh night, he returned to the salt tunnels, not to buy, but to ask. The vendor with the scarf was gone. In his place stood a woman, tall and pale, her hands dusted with soot. "I need to know," Emil said, showing her the remains of his last loaf. "What's in this?" She narrowed her eyes. "You ate it, didn't you?" He nodded. She leaned in close, voice low. Then you already know. Emil swallowed hard. The dreams? They come to all of us, those who eat from the black ovens. It's the mold. It grows in the grain we can't dry. The damp tunnels feed it. Some say it makes you see God. Others say it shows you what's coming. Emil felt cold. It's poison. Everything's poison now, she said simply. Water, smoke, lies. She turned and pointed toward a far chamber, dimly lit with red flame. They bake the strong bread down there, she whispered, for the ones who want more than just to survive. Emil hesitated. He then walked. The tunnel narrowed, twisting like a wound through the rock. The air grew hotter. The scent of yeast and rot was stronger now, richer, darker. At the end of the path, he found them, 4 bakers, faces wrapped in cloth, working over an open pit. The fire glowed strange, casting long shadows on the walls. Around them, sacks of grain, blackened, wet, steaming with fermentation. They didn't look up as he approached. A loaf sat cooling on a stone slab. It was smaller than the salt bread, shaped like a knot, its crust cracked with lines of dark green and purple. Emil picked it up. It pulsed faintly in his hand, warm and wrong. "What is this?" he asked. One of the bakers finally spoke. "The future." Emil stared at the bread. He thought of his mother, of the ration posters, of the woman dragged away screaming for stealing flour, of the riot in the square, of the guards who never came to help. He took the bread, paid with silence, and walked back into the night, unsure if he was still Emil or something else.
He didn't tell her where it came from. When Emil returned, dawn was creeping up the narrow streets of Paris, brushing the rooftops with a weak gold that held no warmth. His mother was still asleep, if that's what it was. Her breath came in shallow pulls. Her skin had taken on a grayness that no fire could cure. He held the strange loaf in his hands. It hadn't cooled. If anything, it was warmer than before. The cracks along the crust had deepened, splitting open like veins. A smell clung to it, bitter, sour, and something almost sweet. He set it by the fire, waited for courage. But courage in Paris came in strange forms now, not from speeches or sabers or dreams of liberty, but from hunger. The kind of hunger that whispered, "You'll do worse than this." He tore it in half. The inside was moist, black, laced with threads of violet, like bruises running through flesh. He tasted it. Just one bite, and the world tipped. The fire swelled before his eyes, bursting into petals of orange and blue. The room shifted sideways. He smelled smoke, but it wasn't wood. It was hair, skin, the coppery tang of spilled blood beneath banners he didn't recognize. He saw his mother young again, laughing in a garden that didn't exist. He saw his father standing in the bakery they'd once owned, whole and smiling and alive. He saw himself standing over a crowd, hands red, mouth full of words he couldn't remember speaking. Then, darkness. When he opened his eyes, the loaf was gone. All of it. His mouth was dry, his hands trembled, his vision swam. And his mother? She was awake, staring at him. She said, "I saw your father. I was dreaming. He He said we'd be okay. She reached for his hand. For the first time in days, she had strength. "What did you do?" she asked gently. He didn't answer, because he wasn't sure. The days that followed passed in pieces. Emil moved through them like smoke, half there, half lost. The city outside changed. The posters grew bloodier, the crowds thinner. Executions came more often, but no one screamed anymore. It was too cold, too normal. And still, Emil returned to the salt tunnels. Each time the bread was different, one round and soft, another sharp and flat like a blade. He stopped asking what was in them, stopped wondering what they did, because now he needed them. Not just for food, but to remember, to feel, to believe for a few seconds that the world had not fully rotted through. His mother grew stronger, but the spark in her eyes turned strange. She started asking him questions at night, about dreams, about the bread, about the feeling of being outside herself. He never answered, because deep down he knew what she was really asking. She wanted more. And Emil knew. Once you tasted the black bread, once you let it rewrite you from the inside, there was no going back. The salt tunnels were not a bakery. They were a door, and Emil had stepped through.
The salt tunnels waited below Paris like a secret beneath a secret, dark, damp, and woven with the slow drip of forgotten years. Emil moved through them now with a growing familiarity, the cold stone walls a grim comfort against the chaos above. The smell of salt and earth clung to his clothes, mingling strangely with the faint scent of the bread that had become his tether. Each loaf was a puzzle, a fragile piece of a past that both beckoned and repelled. Some tasted of smoke and ash, others carried hints of wild berries or bitter herbs Emil couldn't name. But every bite brought the same shifting visions, the flicker of faces long gone, whispers of laughter that echoed like ghosts, and moments caught between memory and dream. He learned not to fear these visions, though they left him hollowed and raw. They were the threads that tied him to a world that the revolution had tried to tear apart. His family's faded smiles, the warmth of their bakery's hearth, the soft voice of his mother before sickness claimed her. But the more he tasted, the more the bread changed him. His reflection grew unfamiliar in the cracked mirrors of the tunnels. Eyes darker, hands trembled less, his gait steadier, but beneath it all a hunger, deeper than hunger, gnawed at his bones. Not just for food, but for the stories the bread carried, the secrets it whispered beneath its crust. At night, when the city's restless heart pulsed above, Emil found himself speaking to shadows, to the ghosts that lingered in the salt. "Which made you?" he whispered to the walls. "What price did they pay for your shape?" Sometimes the tunnel answered, a breath of wind that carried the scent of flour and sweat, a distant murmur of voices in a language half remembered, a faint tapping like fingers tracing spirals in the dark. His mother watched him from her bed, her eyes now sharp with an unsettling clarity. She pressed her palm to his cheek, tracing the lines of a face that seemed to belong to someone else. She said one evening, voice fragile yet firm, "Promise me," she said one evening, "promise me you will not lose yourself in the past. The bread is not our salvation." Emil wanted to believe her, but the loaf in his bag whispered otherwise. And as Paris burned with fury and fear, he knew the truth. The bread was no simple food.
It was a doorway, and once you stepped through, the world beyond was not the one you left behind.
The fires above Paris were no longer distant flickers, but a relentless blaze, swallowing neighborhoods in a slow, suffocating roar. Smoke twisted into the sky like dark fingers clawing at the fading light. In the alleys, shadows darted between collapsed carts and abandoned wares, while cries mingled with the crackling inferno, a city's heartbeat breaking under the weight of its own rebellion. Emile moved beneath it all, his footsteps echoing softly on the damp stone of the salt tunnels. The air was thick with salt and soot, a bitter reminder that even below the chaos, ruins seeped through every crack. The bread in his satchel grew heavier, its crust hardening as if it had absorbed the anguish of the streets above. His visions grew sharper, more vivid. Faces he could not name appeared, eyes full of sorrow, mouths twisted in silent screams, hands reaching out from shadowed corners of memory. The whispers followed him like ghosts trailing smoke, telling stories of families torn apart, promises broken beneath the watchful eyes of guillotines and soldiers. One night, in the hollow silence of the tunnels, Emile knelt beside a pile of rubble, a collapsed wall revealing a mosaic of broken tiles, their colors dulled but their patterns unmistakable. Among the shards lay a small wooden box, worn and bound with iron. His fingers trembled as he lifted the lid, revealing a collection of letters, folded tight like secrets pressed between pages. They spoke of hunger, not just of the body, but of the soul. Of a people starving for justice, yet starving themselves in the process. Of bread stolen from hands too weak to fight, and hopes baked into crusts that would never be broken. Emile felt the weight of their words settle deep inside him, a reminder that the revolution's hunger was more than famine. It was the slow gnawing away of humanity itself. He folded the letters carefully, tucking them beneath the loaf. Above, the city groaned under its own despair. And below, the bread waited, silent, patient, and hungry for the next to taste its bitter truth.
The city's hunger was no longer just in empty stomachs, but in broken spirits. Marketplaces lay silent, their once vibrant stalls reduced to splinters and dust. Mothers pressed thin hands to their children's mouths, begging silence against the gnawing ache that no amount of prayer could fill. The grand halls of the aristocracy echoed with whispers of flight, but for the common folk, there was no escape, only the slow death beneath the indifferent sky. Emile's footsteps traced the same weary path through the salt tunnels, now a labyrinth of memories and despair. The bread in his bag was brittle, its surface cracked like the streets above, yet still it carried a strange warmth, as if it held the last embers of a dying fire. He shared it with those who sought refuge in the darkness, a woman whose eyes had forgotten how to cry, a man whose hands shook from cold and hunger, children too young to understand the weight of revolution, but old enough to know its cruelty. Each bite was a silent communion, a fragile thread connecting them to a world slipping away. But the bread whispered still, its crust cracked and crumbled, revealing glimpses of places and faces long gone. A banquet hall frozen in time, a table set with silver and wine, laughter trapped in the air like cobwebs, a candle flickering beside a lone figure whose eyes glimmered with a sadness older than the stones beneath them. Emile shivered. The bread was no mere sustenance. It was a vessel of memory, carrying the feast of shadows that had fed the city's dreams and nightmares. He wrapped the remains carefully, placing them beside the letters, and in the quiet he heard the faintest echo of a voice. "Remember us." Outside, the revolution's firestorm raged on. Inside, the hunger deepened, and the bread waited for the next mouth to break its spell.
The city was a cage set aflame. Every street, every alleyway pulsed with a fever born from fear and fury. The revolution, once a distant promise, had become an unforgiving reality where the poor fought the poor and hope seemed a luxury none could afford. Emile moved through this burning maze, his path both chosen and imposed, as though the loaf of bread in his bag weighed more than the hunger in his belly. He had learned that the bread was a language, not one of words, but of taste and texture, of scent and memory. Each loaf told a story, each crumb whispered a secret, each crust bore the imprint of lives long extinguished. But with every bite, Emile felt himself slipping further from the world above, the world of screaming crowds, of clashing steel and crashing ideals. The bread did not simply feed, it consumed. It gnawed at his soul, pulling him toward a past he barely understood but could no longer escape. One evening, the streets were slick with rain, reflecting the flickering lanterns and torches that cast trembling shadows on the walls. The guillotine stood in the square, its blade catching the pale moonlight like a cruel promise. Crowds gathered, voices rising and falling in chants and prayers. Mothers clutched their children, eyes wide with terror, while men stood stoic, faces hardened by loss and fury. Emile slipped through the gathering, unseen and unheard, until he found a corner where the scent of bread was faint but unmistakable. A woman knelt by a makeshift altar, her hands trembling as she broke a loaf and offered pieces to the hungry around her. Their faces were gaunt, eyes hollow, but as they tasted the bread, something flickered. A spark of warmth, a fleeting memory. Emile approached, heart heavy with the weight of what he knew. He offered the bread he carried, crust cracked and worn, the scent sharp with salt and smoke. The woman took it without question, breaking it into pieces and distributing it silently. As the crowd's chant grew louder, the guillotine's blade rose and fell. The sharp crack echoed through the square, a punctuation in the endless dirge of suffering. Emile closed his eyes, feeling the bread in his hands pulse, a heartbeat out of time, a rhythm that spoke of endings and beginnings. He tasted the bread and saw a vision. A long table stretching beneath chandeliers dripping with crystals, filled with faces laughing and feasting in a world of velvet and gold. A child reaching for a candle flame, a servant wiping sweat from a brow, a whispered argument behind closed doors. The same faces, now shadows, were trapped beneath layers of time and hunger. When he opened his eyes, the crowd was gone. The square was empty but for the guillotine's silent blade, dripping with rainwater and forgotten blood. Emile understood then that the bread was not only memory, it was justice. But justice was slow, and hunger was patient. He wrapped the loaf tighter and walked back into the dark streets, where the revolution fed on itself, and the city starved beneath the watchful eyes of ghosts.
The cold had become a second skin. Not the honest cold of winter winds, but something deeper, an inner frost, the kind that crept into marrow and memory, stiffening thought and breath. Paris groaned above, its streets thick with soot and frost-bitten cries, while below, in the salt-dark labyrinth of tunnels and half-buried ruins, Emile followed the faint smell of burnt flour and something sweeter. He had heard whispers, first from a child who spoke only in riddles and stares, then from a washerwoman who claimed her dreams smelled of cinnamon, that beneath the ruins of Saint-Lazare, before it had become a prison, there had once been an oven. Not the hearth of a home, but something older, built into the stone before the city wore its name. It was not on any map, but the bread led him there. Each loaf, each crust torn and tasted, had pointed him forward, deeper into the undercity, where the walls wept salt and the air curled heavy with the breath of centuries. He walked without lantern, letting his fingers trail the stone, letting the damp guide him. The echoes changed as he descended, less cavern, more corridor, less tunnel, more tomb. And then he saw it. The oven, built into the curve of a crumbling apse, black with age, lined with soot too deep to scrape. It had no chimney, no vent, just an opening, wide and low, like the mouth of a sleeping beast. Above it, carved faintly into the stone, was a spiral. Again, always the spiral. Emile hesitated. His satchel pressed heavy against his side, the last loaf wrapped in cloth, warm still, though he hadn't baked it. He had awoken that morning in the hollow of the tunnels to find it resting beside him, crust cracked with patterns that mimicked the folds of a sleeping face. He knelt before the oven, placed the loaf inside, and waited. At first there was nothing, then a scent, not fire, not bread, but memory itself, the kind that stings behind the eyes and makes the heart stutter. He saw his mother, not as she had been in her bed, wan and quiet, but alive, laughing, flower on her cheek. He saw his father's hand resting on his shoulder at the market, warm and firm. He saw the old bakery before it had fallen to rot and revolution, smoke rising from the chimney, the wooden sign swinging in the wind. And he heard something else. Voices, low, humming, chanting in rhythm with the drip of water. Not French, not any language he knew, but it meant something. Deep in his chest, in the coil of his spine, he understood. The bread remembers. And then the loaf began to smoke. The spiral on its crust glowed faintly, like embers, and a shape took form behind the oven's mouth, tall, cloaked, more shadow than flesh. A figure with no face, only a shroud of darkness and the soft hiss of breath. It did not step forward. It waited. Emile spoke before he could stop himself. "What are you?" The shadow tilted its head. "The baker," it said. The voice was a rustle of parchment, of dry leaves turned beneath boots. The first, the last, the fire that fed the hunger. Emile's lips trembled. "Why me?" The silence stretched. Then, "You ate." The oven's heat flared, not burning, but blooming, warmth and weight, the pressure of history pressed against the bones. He felt the bread in his stomach shift, settle. The memories it held began to bleed into him more deeply, anchoring not just as visions, but as truths. He saw the beginning, a famine, a curse, a loaf shaped from ash and marrow, passed from hand to hand, each bite taking something, each crumb remembering. He saw Paris built atop its own hunger, feeding on itself through centuries, bread turned into ritual, into relic, into judgment. The figure behind the oven raised a hand, and Emile knew. He could walk away,
Return to the surface. Let the hunger claim the rest as it always had. Or he could stay. Feed the fire. Become the memory. He reached into the oven, his hand shaking as he touched the crust of the still glowing bread. It burned, but it did not wound. And when he pulled it free, the spiral was gone. In its place, a circle, whole, closed. Above, the city raged, but below, in the oven's glow, Emile understood. To end the hunger, one must remember all of it. Even the first bite, even the last bite.
The surface of Paris cracked under its own weight. Not visibly. No fissures split the stones, no buildings toppled in the night, but beneath its cobbled veins, the city groaned, a sound like forgotten bells tolling underground. The revolution screamed itself hoarse above, but deep in the salt dark quiet, Emile sat with the bread that no longer steamed and no longer crumbled. It pulsed, instead. Not visibly, not like a heart, but Emile felt it, a soft rhythm in his palms when he held it close. The crust was sealed now, smooth and dense, a complete circle of hardened grain that shimmered with traces of ash and honey. Inside, he knew, were not ingredients, but stories. Generations of hunger folded into a flower. He placed it in his satchel and rose. The oven behind him had cooled. The figure, the baker, was gone, or perhaps it had only ever been a shadow he was finally able to see. But its presence lingered in the soot, in the scent, and in the heat that still sat heavy in Emile's bones. He left Saint Lazare behind. The streets above greeted him with ash. Snow fell, but it was blackened, dirty, thin flakes drifting like burnt pages. Emile pulled his coat tighter, though the cold barely touched him now. Hunger gnawed at the windows of the city. People stared at him as he passed, wide-eyed and silent, as if he had returned from the dead with something they feared but needed. He made his way to the river. The Seine moved slowly, half frozen, its surface dotted with floating debris, wood, cloth, the occasional unnameable bundle wrapped in sorrow. On the bridge, a small group gathered around a pot that smoked but gave off no scent. A child stirred it with a stick. A man muttered about salt. No one looked each other in the eye. Emile stepped forward, unwrapping the loaf with hands that no longer shook. They saw it immediately. Not just bread. Bread. Something deeper than sustenance. A memory of something pure, something sacred, or dangerous. A woman reached toward it with trembling fingers. Her nails were blue, her cheeks sunken, but her eyes were wide with wonder. "May I?" she asked, though no one had asked permission for anything in months. Emile nodded. She tore a piece from the crust and held it like a sacrament. When she ate, her face changed. Not in joy, not even relief, but recognition. "I remember," she whispered, as tears welled. "The mill house, the sound it made, my brother dancing in the flour." Others came forward, a young man, a midwife, an old soldier with a shaking leg. Each took a piece. Each remembered. And as they did, Emile felt the loaf grow lighter, not in weight, but in history. He sat as the loaf passed from hand to hand. No one gorged, no one fought. They tore it gently, reverently, as if feeding a fire they'd forgotten how to tend. And when the last piece was taken, Emile felt something release inside him, a tension that had lived in his jaw, in his shoulders, in the marrow of his hunger. It loosened. It sighed. He looked down. His hands were empty, and yet they glowed faintly, golden flower lines trailing along the creases of his palms. The child who'd stirred the pot looked up at him. "You're the baker now, aren't you?" Emile opened his mouth, then closed it.
because there was no answer. Because the question wasn't really a question. He rose, slowly, and walked through the alleys, past the hushed doorways, towards a square where the guillotine waited, its blade rusted, unmoving. A loaf does not stop a war, but a loaf remembers. And now the city did too. Wherever Emile passed, people looked up, not with hope, but with recognition, as if they too had tasted something that made them see, not the future, but the shape of the past, spiraled, folded, risen, and for the first time in weeks, as Emile vanished into the smoke-lined streets, Paris did not scream. It listened.
The bakeries were empty, not looted, abandoned, stone ovens cold, flour sacks torn open like slain animals, counters dusted with the ghosts of yesterday's crusts. They stood across Paris like ruined shrines, relics of a world where bread had been simple, clean, unburdened. Now every loaf was an invocation, every crumb a scripture. Word of Emile traveled in whispers. Not his name, most had forgotten it already, but the one with the bread. They spoke of him in marketplaces where no one bought, near fountains that had long since run dry. They said he walked without shoes now, that he left no prints even in the mud, that when he touched your hand, you dreamed of firelight and barley, of a table set long ago. But Emile was not a prophet. He was tired. The hunger had not left. It had changed. It was no longer in his belly, but in the world around him. A gnawing emptiness, not of flesh, but of meaning. The city still cracked with the sounds of suffering, but now there was something else underneath. Something older, pulsing low like a forgotten drum. He followed it through the slums and into the broken cloisters of the old cathedral, where stained glass wept light onto floors littered with bones of pigeons and revolution. A makeshift choir of beggars huddled in the apse, humming tunelessly, their eyes closed. In the center knelt a woman, her hair wild and white as frost. When she opened her eyes, Emile froze. They were milky with blindness, but she saw him. She whispered, "You brought it back." He said nothing. She reached out, fingers searching. He took her hand. It was cold and dry, but her grip was strong. She said, "I remember. The old starter, the one they fed with prayers and blood. They kept it in a sealed jar behind the icon of St. Marthe. Said it was cursed. Said it rose even when the world fell." Emile opened his satchel. There was nothing inside. But the woman smiled. "You don't carry it. It carries you now." She pressed a hand to his chest. And Emile felt it. The rise, the ferment, the slow, ancient swell of something becoming. They gave him shelter in the apse, lit candles from fat drippings and animal tallow. The blind woman, who called herself Toinette, prepared a slurry of flour and spit and ash. They left it uncovered on a broken altar where the wind could sing through the cracks. She said, "We'll call it back." The next morning, it bubbled. Tiny blisters formed in the paste, air from nowhere, life from rot. A sour tang rose from it, familiar and sharp. He had no oven, so they built one. Stone by stone from the rubble, mortared with mud and salt, fed with splinters from the broken pews and beams long collapsed. It smoked at first, thick and coughing, but it held. And when the first loaves came out, burned, misshapen, crusted with too much salt, they tore them apart with reverence. Each bite was a silence, each swallow a memory stitched back into the ragged soul of the city. They called them the sourdough saints, those who gathered in the cathedral, those who remembered how to wait. No sermons, no chants, just the kneading, the rising, the sharing. Others came, from the barricades, from the river, from the gallows, not to pray, to eat.
And as they ate, they wept for what they'd lost, for what they might become again. Outside, the world burned slower. Inside, something rose. And in the shadows of the apse, Emil stood with flour on his hands and smoke in his hair. Not healed, not holy, just whole. And the bread, warm, cracked, alive, rested on the altar like an answer without a question. Because the hunger would return. It always did. But now, so would the bread.
Winter loosened its grip, but it did not leave. In the alleys and beneath the rafters, the cold lingered like grief, a presence more than a temperature. Snow no longer fell, but the frost remained, clinging to shutters and soaking into boots. The revolution had slowed to a crawl, its passion starved, its fire reduced to smoke. Paris still screamed, but hoarsely now, like an old man arguing in his sleep. Inside the cathedral, the starter had begun to dream. Toinette said as much one morning, wiping flour from her hands and staring at the bubbling bowl as though it had spoken. "It's remembering things that never were," she said. "Past lives, other mouths." Emil didn't ask what she meant. He'd begun to understand that some things, like hunger and song and the long patience of dough, could not be translated into words. The sourdough no longer rose at ordinary pace. It surged, eager, trembling, almost wild. They fed it with strange things now. Crushed rosemary from a soldier's satchel, ashes from a burned pamphlet, even the dried tears of a woman who hadn't cried in 15 years. Every feeding brought new shapes to the crust, new tastes to the crumb. Cinnamon and rust, tobacco and rosewater. Every bite a riddle. And the people kept coming, not in crowds, in currents. Drifting into the cathedral like wind through broken glass, like incense through old velvet. They came for bread, yes, but they stayed because the hunger was no longer just in the belly. It was in their language, their posture, their silence. Once a man with soot on his face and blood beneath his fingernails sat with Emil by the oven. He tore a heel from the latest loaf, held it up to candlelight and said, "My son died last month, starved. I buried him in a flour sack, but this," he tapped the crust, eyes sharp. "This tastes like he didn't die for nothing." Emil nodded. He understood. Each loaf was becoming a grave marker, a eulogy in yeast, a defiance not shouted through revolution but whispered through fermentation. One night, Emil dreamed he was inside the starter, not beside it, inside it. He floated in warmth, sour and alive. The bubbles around him breathed like lungs, and each one held a scene: a bakery burning in Rouen, a boy stealing crust from a convent table, a king eating brioche with fingers stained in ink and wine, a woman grinding acorns into flour with a stone as large as her grief. He woke with a jolt. His hands were sticky with dough, but he hadn't touched the bowl. Toinette was already awake, sitting in the apse with a candle and a brush made of horsehair. She was painting spirals on the walls, slow, careful spirals that shimmered with some kind of paste made from ash and egg white. The spirals hummed. "You're inside it now," she said, without looking up. "There's no going back." That evening, the bread sang. Truly sang. No voice, no melody, just a vibration that passed through the crust as it cooled, a hum that resonated in the stone and skin alike. The first to hear it dropped her slice and covered her mouth in awe. The second fell to his knees. The third wept openly and whispered the name of a sister long dead. Emil placed his hand on the cooling loaf. The crust was still, but his palms shook, because he recognized the hum. It was the same rhythm as the spiral, the same sound that came from the door beneath Saint Lazare. The memory wasn't just returning, it was spreading.
not like plague, like pollen. It settled in mines, in flour sacks, in the ink of public decrees, in the dreams of the night watchmen. It folded into the marrow of the city. And Emile, once a boy who had run from a dying bakery, now stood at the edge of something ancient and alive, something that had waited and was now waking. Because bread at its heart was never just food. It was a story you swallowed. And the story was not finished yet.
At night, the cathedral began to sweat. Not water, not dew, but a faint, syrupy film that clung to the stones like breath on glass, sweet at first, then sharp, like vinegar left too long in the barrel. The walls absorbed it, so did the loaves. They came out of the oven glistening now, darker than before, heavy with more than grain. The people no longer asked what was in them. They just ate and remembered. The city whispered it now, there's something in the bread. Not poison, not salvation, something older. Toinette had grown thinner, though she never skipped a meal. She rarely slept either, content to sit in the apse, muttering to the rising dough in a voice barely louder than breath. I think it remembers more than I do, she told Emile one morning. Her fingers were cracked, speckled with flour and soot. It's showing me things, places I never went, lives I never lived. She handed him a roll, small and twisted, stamped with a spiral on the top. Taste this, she said. He did, and for a moment he wasn't standing in a ruined cathedral. He was in a cave, firelight on walls slick with moss, a woman singing as she crushed roots with a stone, a loaf rising beside her. No yeast, no starter, just time, just heat, just hunger. He dropped the roll. Toinette didn't flinch. You see, she said, it remembers everything. The others began to change too. Their eyes grew glassy. Their words slowed. They touched the loaves before they ate them, hands trembling, reverent. No more hunger pangs, no begging, just silence, listening, as if each bite pulled them deeper into the same story. Not a dream, a reconstruction. They weren't healing from the famine. They were becoming part of it, one by one. Emile stood outside the cathedral that evening, watching the smoke curl from the oven chimney. It smelled like burnt rosemary and river mud. The square around them was empty. No riots, no screams. Even the rats had vanished. He noticed something then. The loaves never went moldy. They stayed fresh, warm, as if the oven's fire lived in them still. One sat on the altar for 4 days untouched. It steamed every time he passed. He broke it open on the 5th. Inside, something blinked. Not an eye, not quite, but the shape of recognition. Like the bread was learning him back. That night, he walked to the Seine. The river barely moved, half frozen again, choked with frost and silence. He dropped a slice into the water and watched it float. It didn't sink. It pulsed once, and then drifted upstream.
They came at dusk. Not the starving, not the sick, not this time. These were men in red coats, polished boots slick with alley mud, the scent of gunpowder and fear clinging to their collars. The National Guard, what remained of them, though thinner now, slower, hollow-eyed. Revolution had drained them as much as anyone. They said they'd heard rumors of a cult, of bread that whispered, of a cathedral turned shrine. They called it sedition, called it madness, but none dared step over the threshold. They stood in the square as the smoke from the old oven rolled past their knees, warm as blood. One lifted a pistol, another a torch. Their commander barked threats, legal words, the last defense of a regime already bleeding out. Inside, Emile kept kneading, not out of defiance, out of rhythm. His hands had learned the tempo older than orders, older than kings, older, perhaps, than time. Toinette watched from the apse, her eyes milky now with more than blindness. She didn't blink, she didn't move. Let them shout. They'll hear it soon, she said. Outside, the commander's voice cracked, the pistol shook. And then the smell reached them. They said later it was the crust, something about the caramelized edge, the hint of char, the ghost of herbs buried deep in the dough. One soldier dropped his musket. Another fell to his knees. The commander staggered back, mumbling about a kitchen from childhood, a mother with flour in her hands, a warm bun before school. They didn't shoot. They didn't burn. They wept and left. That night the starter grew louder. It hissed. It pulsed. It sang in a language not heard since wheat first bent to the wind. Emile no longer slept. He walked the cathedral like a priest, like a keeper of relics, because the bread wasn't just food now. It was memory. It was map. It was message. The people began to change. Not all at once, and not in ways you'd see with a glance, but they stopped shivering. Their eyes darkened, not to disease, but depth. They spoke less, but understood more. Their skin took on a warmth, a glow, not fever, but fire. They had risen. And in the center of it all, the altar, piled now with loaves not baked, but born. No oven could explain them, no recipe. Some were shaped like hearts, others like lungs. One looked like a face Emile couldn't name, but felt in his marrow. The starter had cracked its bowl. It now stretched across the stone like veins, feeding from the city, feeding to the city. Toinette called it the covenant. She said the bread had chosen them, not because they were good, but because they were empty. And emptiness, she said, was the true vessel. Emile began to forget words, not all at once, but nouns slipped first, then names. He called things by texture, by taste, by memory. A cup became the smooth-handled thing, a candle the firebone. He still understood language, but the bread had taught him another, one of weight, one of warmth, one of hum. He didn't resist, because the city had already changed. You could see it in the smoke, in the rhythm of footsteps. The hungry no longer begged. They listened, and when they ate, they didn't chew. They communed. Then came the morning when the loaves stopped cooling. They came out warm and stayed warm, always warm, like breath, like blood. And the people began to carry them home like infants, swaddled, whispered to, rocked to sleep. One woman said her bread had spoken in a dream, said it called her sister. Another said hers wept, said the crust cracked like an eyelid opening.
They weren't afraid, because hunger had been worse. And this was connection. Emil stood before the altar one last time, the spiral now carved deep in the stone, glowing faintly. The starter breathed behind him. He took one final loaf, round, dark, scored with lines that looked almost like writing. He broke it open. Steam rose. Not scent, not heat. Words. And in his bones he heard the bread say, "Now you are ready."
They no longer measured time by bells. They measured it by rises and falls, by the breath of the starter, by the warmth that passed from loaf to hand to heart. Day and night had melted into a single slow rhythm. Proof, bake, cool, remember. But the bread did not forget, and the remembering deepened. It began in fragments. A woman bit into a crust and saw a mountain she'd never climbed. A boy licked the torn edge of a heel and tasted salt from a sea he'd never sailed. A man tore a crumb between his fingers and wept for a wife he'd never married, whose name he somehow knew, Elise. These were not dreams. They were returnings. Memories not from lives they had lived, but from lives the bread had stored. Lives it had collected. Twinette said it had always been that way. Bread is the oldest witness, she whispered, her voice nearly dust. It watched us before we were born, and it remembers what we've tried to forget. Her eyes had turned the color of cooling ash. Her skin was soft now, like flour, like she could dissolve in warm water. Emil found her standing before the spiral that evening, palms open, head tilted. "It's full," she said, barely audible. "We are full." Then she collapsed, like a doll stitched too loosely. Her body did not fall hard, it floated down. And when Emil knelt beside her, she was not dead, not gone, just changed. Her chest still rose and fell, but slowly, with the same rhythm as the starter. Her mouth moved without sound. Her fingers traced symbols on the flagstones, curves, loops, a language without letters. She didn't speak again, not aloud. But the loaves that rose after that day had her shape, her scent, her smile carved faintly in the crust. The people understood. They did not grieve. They listened. By then, no one came to the cathedral from outside. No messengers, no guards, no orders. Only pigeons circled above, cooing in strange cadences. Only wind passed through the doors. The revolution had moved on, or collapsed inward, or perhaps, like so many other things, it had been absorbed. The city had thinned, but the people inside the cathedral, those who stayed, were not thin. They were whole, heavy with memory, rooted in warmth. Each had a task. One baked, one swept, one sat in the rafters and hummed to the starter. Emil's hands never stopped. He didn't think of it as baking anymore. He thought of it as translation, taking what the dough whispered and shaping it into something the body could understand. Each loaf a letter, each crust a phrase, each crumb a breath. Sometimes he fed the starter's silence, sometimes music. Once he dropped in the ashes of an old newspaper, and the loaves that week came out sharp, bitter, prophetic. Once he bled into the bowl, and the bread came out tasting like names he had never spoken. It was never the same, but it was always right. One morning, the starter was gone. Not spilled, not spoiled, just not there. In its place was a circle of warm air and a faint imprint on the stone, as if something had curled there for a long time and finally stood. The bowl sat empty, clean, dry. Emil did not panic. He bowed and baked with what was left in his hands. That day, the bread did not sing. It wept, a low, keening sound. Not sad exactly, not mournful, just full. The people gathered. They sat on the floor, on the pews, in the eaves. They tore the loaves into pieces, passed them to one another. And as they chewed, they remembered the storm over the bay, the harvest that never came, the child who asked for flour for her doll, the sound of the guillotine before dawn, the whisper of poppies growing over bones. And they wept, not because they were hungry, because they were remembered. And remembering is a kind of resurrection. That night, Emil slept beside the oven. It stayed warm long after the fire went out. He dreamed of a table with no edges, where loaves passed hand to hand in a circle that never broke. And when he woke, the walls of the cathedral had changed. No longer stone, now crust, risen, soft, and still baking. The cathedral had become the bread, and the bread had become the world.
By the 22nd rising, Emil stopped marking time altogether. There were no bells now, no sunrise or sunset, no lines drawn between the sacred and the profane. The cathedral had become one long, slow breath, inhaling memory, exhaling warmth. Every sound inside was muffled, as though cushioned by centuries of flour and patience. Even the pigeons had roosted inside, cooing lullabies no human had taught them, as if they too had been fed. The walls no longer echoed, they absorbed. You could whisper anything, sorrow, confession, a joke from childhood, and the cathedral would take it in, soften it, knead it into its bones. The next loaf would carry its shape, its scent, its ache. That was the covenant now. No sermons, no gods, just bread. Living bread. And Emil, no longer baker, no longer man, had become its steward. He slept in the sacristy on a bed of cooling racks, wrapped in linen that smelled faintly of caraway and ash. He no longer dreamed in pictures. He dreamed in flavors, in textures, in lives he hadn't lived but could still taste. A woman giving birth in winter, blood warming straw. A blind soldier licking honey from his fingers. A boy dying in a granary, smiling because he smelled his mother's rye bread baking. They were not visions, they were ingredients. The people of the cathedral, if they could still be called people, had grown gentle. They moved slowly, deliberately. Their eyes shone not with hunger but with completion. They spoke only when necessary, and always in short, round sentences, like loaves shaped with care. They still ate daily, but not for nourishment, for communion, and always together. They tore the loaves open like rituals, steam rising like incense. The insides were soft, dense with memory, sometimes purple, sometimes gold, sometimes marbled with ink-black spirals. No two loaves were ever the same, but all carried the same feeling. You are not alone. Even when no one touched the oven, it stayed warm. Even when the firewood ran out, the bread kept rising. No yeast, no salt, no flour left, but still the bread, the memory of bread. And that, Emil had learned, was stronger than any recipe. He began leaving the cathedral at dusk, not to escape, but to offer. A heel placed on a windowsill, a roll on a butcher's block, a tiny round bowl at the feet of a crumbling statue. They were always gone by morning, sometimes with notes left in their place. She spoke to me. My dead husband laughed again. I remember a song my grandmother hummed, and once, simply, "Thank you for forgiving me." It was not Emil they thanked. It was the loaf, the witness, the living record of hunger. One morning he returned to find the apse filled, not with people, but with loaves. Hundreds, all different sizes, colors, weights, all untouched. No one had baked them. No one had placed them. They had risen themselves. The spiral had expanded across the floor now, cracking the stones, curling beneath the pews. It pulsed with warmth. It smelled of cloves and wet earth. At the center something waited. Emil approached slowly. The light in the apse flickered like candlelight, but there were no flames. Just the loaves, watching. He knelt at the spiral's center. And there it was, a single roll, perfect, small, still steaming. He knew what it was before he touched it. Him. His whole life, baked, condensed, remembered. He lifted it to his lips, shaking. He bit. And the cathedral sighed. It sighed through the arches, through the floorboards, through the very bones of Paris. And in that moment, Emil understood. The bread did not need to be eaten, it needed to eat. To be eaten was to become part of the great remembering, to feed the hunger that never stopped, the hunger that built churches and started wars, the hunger for belonging, for warmth, for return. Emil sat back, chewing slowly. Tears ran down his cheeks. Not sadness, gratitude. The crust cracked like old wood. The crumb melted like childhood. And inside, a voice he had never heard and had always known whispered, "You endured. Now let me endure you." The last piece dissolved on his tongue, and Emil closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to rise.
There was no body to bury, no final breath, no shroud, no mourners in black. Emil was simply gone. And yet he was everywhere. In the scent rising from the apse each morning, in the way the walls swelled and sighed with the tide of breathless memory, in the crust that now never burned, never cracked, never hardened beyond kindness. The people did not speak of his disappearance. They only baked more gently, broke their loaves more slowly, passed the bread with softer hands and heavier eyes. They had always known, in some quiet, marrow-deep way, that Emil was not the first, that the warmth had once come from another, and before them, another still. The cathedral was old, older than memory, older than Paris, older, perhaps, than grief itself. But now, it was full. The spiral had reached the sky. You could see it in the beams of light that sliced through the upper stained glass, each ray curved, bent not by glass, but by presence, by the weight of remembrance folding the air. People came to the cathedral now with offerings, not of gold, but of memory. A crust wrapped in a love letter, a heel soaked in old tears, a stale roll broken over a grave and still warm when carried inside. The walls welcomed it all, absorbed it, turned it to sustenance. And when the loaves emerged, they were heavier than bread should be, because they carried lives, whole ones. A man once held a roll and heard the laughter of a sister long dead. A woman bit into a boule and remembered the day her son was born in a barn while thunder shook the eaves. A soldier, gaunt and stinking of ash, chewed slowly and saw a face he had forgotten, his own, before he learned to kill. And in each case, They wept, and left full, not with food, with belonging. Some never left. They sat near the oven. They hummed with the pigeons. They whispered thanks into the wood grain of pews, because they had found the one thing every war, every famine, every revolution had denied them: a place to be remembered without fear. And then one morning, years or centuries later, it no longer mattered. The oven went cold. The loaves stopped rising. Not with grief, with peace. The spiral glowed faintly. The last crust cooled, and the cathedral exhaled. A deep, honey-slow sigh that rippled through the floor, down into the stone, through the bones of the city. And everywhere, everywhere, ovens blinked open. Tiny hearths, ash-choked brick mouths, forgotten fireplaces and abandoned bakeries, even the warm hollows of travelers' palms, all of them glowed, all of them remembered, because Emil was never meant to stay. He had become recipe, and recipes were meant to be shared. It began quietly. One loaf in Alsace, another in Crackle, a sourdough starter in Sicily that bubbled with whispers of a woman who danced barefoot in the rain. Then dozens, then hundreds, then the world was baking again. Not out of hunger, but out of hope. Flour and salt, water and fire, and the soul of a man who once knelt before a spiral and gave himself to warmth. The cathedral in Paris still stands. It no longer echoes. It hums, with the breath of every hand that ever shaped dough in grief or joy or memory. With the weight of every crust that ever bore the silence of the forgotten. There is no priest, no keeper, no door. Only bread. And bread never closes, because the world will always be hungry. And now, finally, the bread remembers us all.